Hi and welcome to this week's Property Matters, the programme that brings global trends to an Irish audience to help shape your knowledge of the industry. You can email us on hello@iPropertyRadio.com or on Twitter it's iPropertyRadio. As usual, our hosts today are myself, Bryan Fox, and Carol Tallon. And first we're going to go to the headlines because price property has slowed nationally, with Dublin showing the most significant cooling off according to the Independent this week. The latest report from myhome.ie found that annual asking price inflation fell to 2.4% nationally in the second quarter of the year, the lowest level has been in 5 years. Now in Dublin, that figure entered negative territory for the first time since 2013. It's down to minus 0.6%. Despite the downward trend in the annual inflation rate, the report, which is published in association with Davy, found asking prices are continuing to rise. Asking price nationally rose by 2.1% in the second quarter of this year compared with the previous quarter. In Dublin, prices rose by 0.5% in the same period. This is the weakest second quarter gain since 2012. Overall, the median asking price for new sales nationally was €276,000, while in Dublin it was €382,000. UK construction sector output falls at steepest rates since 2009. Indeed, output in the construction industry sector fell at its steepest rate since April 2009 in June, according to a close-watched activity survey. The Purchasing Managers Index showed declines across the sector over the month, adding to the evidence of a wider economic slowdown in the second quarter of the year. The index for construction showed a reading of 43.1 in June, down from 48.6 in the previous month and way below the expectations of economists. Brexit, I think. But Carol, over to you with the next.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting one. And actually, Brian, it's quite interesting to note there that while the index showed a reading of 43.1%, I think anything above 50% is required for growth. So that means it's actually stopped growing. So that's an important stat to look for, particularly in the context of the Irish market and the impact that will have. But here in Ireland, I think the big news story of the week so far is that effective immediately, we've 19 new areas across 11 counties have been designated as rent pressure zones. So that's on foot of the Rental Tenancies Act and the reform of that. So it effectively means that landlords are limited to a maximum of 4% rental increases each year. And it's interesting to note that these changes mean that approximately 2/3 of all rental properties in Ireland now are covered under the rent pressure zones. And also, just for existing landlords, just to point out there that the rent pressure zones, the legislation have extended this to the 31st of December 2021. So in fact, that now means that the rent pressure zones are going to be enforced longer than we thought they were going to be. Okay. So in terms of these changes, the residential tenancy law relating to the rent pressure zones, they means that the Residential Tenancy Board can investigate and sanction breaches, any false notifications, any non-registration of tenancies, and in fact the sanctions for non-compliant landlords have really strengthened there, going from a caution or a fine up to €15,000, and there's more legislative changes on the way. And just to give an overview of the rent pressure zones, you've got towns like Fermoy and Middleton in Cork, Athenry and Gort Kinvara in Galway. Kilkenny has now come under it, Portlaoise, Greycullen and much of Limerick, Dundalk, Ardee and other areas around Meath and the commuter belt. And it's interesting to see that Waterford has come into this now, Waterford City and the boundaries around Waterford, Athlone, Gorey down in Wexford and Arklow in Wicklow.
Just before we go on, I mean, what is is this a correct move to bring all these rural centres into the zones, do you think?
Yeah, I think it is, because we're at a stage now that construction, all of the much of the construction activity was centred in Dublin and the environs, and so that meant that actually supply was becoming better in those areas, which was, I won't say it was easing the rental pressure, but it was certainly adding new rental stock to those areas, where it's actually in rural areas the rent crisis was starting to bite, but there's been no new supply there. So actually the rents were creeping up. Now they're still relatively lower than in Dublin, but they're still creeping up. So actually the rent pressure zones, I think this is very welcome. And I think it's really interesting to say now that 2/3 of all rentals in Ireland are going to be under the rent pressure zones.
Right, but will it still be a business proposition for landlords to let out their properties, do you think?
No. But this isn't the deciding factor of that. In fact, the legislation has become overly burdensome, increasingly onerous on landlords. And, we hear all the time about landlords exiting the market, and the data is sometimes skewed because we have professional investors or institutional landlords coming into the market. But the reality is, individual landlords, accidental landlords, they're exiting the market just as fast as they can. The tax regime here simply doesn't make it worthwhile to be a landlord in Ireland. And the difficulty there, it's fine that we're building all of this built to rent, but we've had estate agents in from outside of Ireland, or from outside of Dublin into the show here, and they're all telling us the same thing. The built to rent is only being delivered in Dublin, Cork and Galway. It's not even being delivered in Limerick. It's not even being delivered in Kilkenny, and it's certainly not being delivered in Dundalk or Athlone or Portlaoise.
The other question, finally, I want to ask you too is the maximum of 4% rental increase. How will that affect? Is that a fair rental increase, or how would you view it?
Yeah, it absolutely is. Rent shouldn't be going up by more than that. So I think this is a fair thing for tenants. It's funny actually. There was a landlord actually I was reading about only in the last couple of weeks, and he was saying that he's charging I think it's €1,800 for a month rent in Dublin 15. But he said €900 of that goes back to the state in tax. So he would be quite happy to receive €600 and pay less in terms of tax, but have the tenants pay less. So he's happy to receive less. He's happy for the tenants to pay less as long as the state takes less. It's a little bit like when we complain about petrol and fuel prices, and then you realise how much actually goes to the state. So I don't see that the rent pressure zones is the only tool at the government's disposal. In actual fact, the tax regime on individual landlords compared to that of institutional landlords and REITs, it's ridiculous that a school teacher in Cavan with one rental apartment is paying more in tax than a REIT or an institutional investor on rental property. It just doesn't make sense.
Discrimination.
It simply doesn't make sense. But the thing is, we're taking away the bottom rung of the ladder. Remember, institutional investors are only ever going to cherry pick the very best areas with the highest paying tenants. So where is all the private rental that's needed for the market? Where is that going to come from?
Very good.
Anyway, sorry, rant over for now. Our first guest in studio, our regular guest, is Emma Hayes, Head of New Media at Property District, and she's here today to talk about some of the public consultations that are live through Place Engage. So Emma, you're very welcome again.
Hiya, how are you guys?
So what news have you for us today?
Well, there's a few public consultations open at present, as there would always be, but if we look at Cork, we have the Cork Docklands to City Centre Road Network Improvement Scheme. We have the Harbour View Road Junctions Improvement Project, and we have the Passage Railway Greenway Improvement Scheme.
That's all happening in Cork.
Yeah, and you can find out more on corkcity.ie about that one. Moving on then, you may remember we had Kevin Smith on here last week, Bryan. He is from Balbriggan, and the Fingal County Council is launching the initial stage of public consultation in relation to a local area plan for Kellystown Dublin 15. The local area plan will consist of a written statement and maps setting out a land use strategy for the proper planning and sustainable development of the area and guidance as to how development can be achieved. They are asking actually for local input, as is considered to be a huge help to the process, and that they value what people say. So
actually I think last week I was listening in last week when Kevin was here, and I genuinely thought he was great because he's exactly the kind of voice we need to capture. Public consultation is exactly that. It's the public being consulted about what changes are happening in the area. And I think sometimes people forget that planning is a public function. And it only works if the public get involved. But unfortunately what tends to happen is that you've got a small number of local people, possibly with vested interests. I'm being very cynical when I say that, but that's the reality. And they tend to hijack the public consultation process by logic objections. So actually what we want to do is let members of the local business and residential community know that these changes are being planned. Their contribution is being sought. This is the government, and this is your local government asking for your voice and your opinion about what's going to happen in terms of safety and greenways and green areas and children's play areas, and where where housing should be and what type of housing it is. This is where the community get to voice their opinion, and now is the time to do it rather than giving out about it on social media after it's done.
Yeah, that's very true. And as you said about people complaining, there's a public consultation up for the preferred route for N55 Athlone to Ballymahon Road. Apparently they met last week, and the N55 Athlone to Ballymahon Road is actually one of the busiest inland roadways in the country. And they're saying, basically, Councillor Tom Farrell did say on local radio that's going to impact severely on landowners and homeowners. So the members of public will have the opportunity to make observations and voice their opinion.
Okay, so what area is that again, sorry?
The Athlone to Ballymahon Road.
Okay.
Yeah.
So people, again, get involved, go onto the local authority website and voice your opinion.
Voice your opinion. And then we had the new diaspora policy to debated in public meetings. A number of public meetings with the Irish community in the UK will be held across the country next month to help the Irish government devise a new diaspora policy. The meetings with the Irish government has said will be a great opportunity for the Irish community in the UK to have their say on government of Ireland and improvement and support connections.
I think that's a really interesting one.
To see how, if it gets its feet off the ground at all.
Okay, well, speaking of the Irish diaspora, right, Bryan, you lived abroad for many years and are recently back. How did you feel as an Irish person living away? How involved did you want to be?
Well, you see, the thing about it is that, I mean, certainly there's a difference, I think, between living in the UK, as I did in London, and the US. I feel that the distance between Dublin or Ireland and the UK is a commute.
Yeah.
You know. Now, okay, for a lot of people, I suppose going from Dublin, I suppose, to New York is becoming a commute as well. But the thing about it is that in the US, I think you take on a stronger Irish-American identity.
As opposed to Irish.
As opposed to Irish, because, for instance, I mean, I'm political. You know, so for instance, the fact that you can't vote in Irish elections can get up your nose, and there's been many attempts over there, particularly in the US and indeed in the UK, to try and get some reform on that. And it's interesting now because we have a senator now in the government, in the Oireachtas, Senator Billy Lawless, who was an Kenny appointee, and his direct job, I suppose, is to try and promote that and to try and promote, try and get more immigration, I suppose, visas for Irish, illegal Irish in the United States. But it's more concerned around those areas in the States. And I must say that for the most part, the Irish bed in very well in the United States.
But is that to the exclusion of having an opinion of what happens in Ireland, about what happens in Ireland, who's elected?
I would venture to say that they're more informed about what's happening in Ireland than they are here.
Oh, I believe that. I genuinely believe that.
Because, you know, in my day there was, you know, when I arrived there first, there was no such thing as internet at all whatsoever. There were all these sort of, in New York particularly, shops that sold international newspapers, and the Irish papers sold very well in those, you know. But there is a sense now when you're Irish over there of being very, very accepted, as opposed, and I know it's been years ago since I've been in London, to England, where there is a sense of being English. You know, now London is a very big city, and it's a very welcoming city as well, but it's still English. Whereas in the United States, New York is everybody's, you know. So the sense of the diaspora and so forth is interesting from that point of view. And it will be interesting to see too, because we know that for the various referendums, the government officials went out to various countries as well, and a lot of them came back to Ireland to vote in the referendums. You know, so there is a consciousness of the country and the way it's turning and all the rest. And actually, I was speaking to my cousin's son who is living in New York at the moment, and he was very conscious of the fact that property is very expensive here and the whole property scene as well, and very angry, you know, and was aware of the fact too that it's a disincentive for business people to locate to Ireland as a result of that.
And is his interest and his feeling around that, is that as somebody who has an interest as in ties to the country, or is it somebody who that in some time in the future might be thinking of returning to Ireland?
Oh no, we'll have very much awareness going on here. I don't think he's looking at returning to Ireland, you know, but also looking at it as a business proposition as well, you know. So, you know, I really do think that what you've just read out there, Emma, the diaspora is something that really does need to be tapped into strongly, because there is a strong link by many Irish people. And you have the Irish clubs in London and all that, and the old associations of the Kilburns and all that. That's changed as well, and of course education's changed that, and so forth. But I think now, if we can extend the voting rights too, whether it be in the Shannon or elsewhere.
Are you in favour of extending voting rights? And sorry, Em, I should ask, is that actually one of the proposals in that?
Actually, they haven't given a full outline on the topics. They're saying that they're going to be explored, and that...
Well, the fact is anyway that we are expecting a referendum anyway on a number of positions in the Shannon to be given to immigrants anyway. You know? But full disclosure, I will give you as soon as I set foot in the States, myself and other few friends organised ourselves in a movement to get the vote, to be able to vote from abroad, you know.
So obviously that's something you're in favour of.
Absolutely,
Okay, I have to say, it's something in theory
that you're not in favour
years ago I was in favour of, and I've lived in the UK and in Spain and in France for a very short but lovely time. Given the size of Ireland, and do you know what's really changed my mind, that I'm just not sure if I am in favour of extending the vote to people not living and resident in the country. It's because I see the power of social media and influence, and quite frankly I would be extremely concerned that we would end up having a popularity contest through Instagram and having somebody like that lovely Longford lady that's appearing on Love Island at the moment, appointed. And I just worry about the influence of social media.
But you look at someone like, and I mean, you like him, I don't mean to be disrespectful about it, but look at Peter Kelly, who came in from I think he was down in Georgia, wasn't it? And he was a businessman, and he went up for the presidential election, and he was caught with the narrative on the itinerants down, but look how he's lived and worked in America all the way through, you know. So I think it's just an era now where we have to accept that sort of stuff, you know. Now, I was slightly idealistic in that I was hoping that we could vote in our constituencies that we've left from abroad, which is slightly idealistic. And the one fear, I know we're talking about property here, but I'll leave it at this. The one fear we had at that time, I shouldn't say one fear I had or my friends had, but government had, was that Sinn Féin was in its early days at the time, you know. And there was a certain nervousness about what the direction they were taking.
I think that's a very valid concern
at that time.
And again, this comes down to the power of social
and
media.
That was before the Good Friday Agreement, etc. You know, so there was a lot of nervousness about where the north of Ireland was going.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very valid concern for a number of different reasons. And you see, again, it comes back to placemaking. If you're not, and I know I circle that back to that point all the time, but I'll tell you, if you're not living in an area, should you be allowed have your say about that area? You know, we looked at this a couple of months ago about the Athenry project that was derailed by a Wicklow man who wanted to sell a site. Interests should be aligned. So if you're not living in the area and you have no intention to return to the area, how interested are you in property prices?
Oh, I would always follow what's going to happen locally as well here. I mean, I'm from the.
But is that out more interest? Will it impact you? I mean, should there be some kind of proviso, as in, if you're planning to return?
But Carol, from a European point of view, every European citizen is allowed to vote in their particular townland or county or city. You know, that's we're the exception to the rule at the moment.
As in, so anybody, actually I wasn't aware of that, so you're saying that anybody from France who's emigrated to the US votes in French elections?
Look at the lines outside Polish embassies or French embassies and so forth. They're all turning up to vote from abroad, you know.
Look, I think it's now, it's interesting. I want the public to have their say. In fact, we've always had a rule about democracy, certainly in our house and in our circle of friends. You don't get to complain about the government if you didn't vote. Doesn't matter which way you voted, but if you didn't vote, you don't get to complain about it. You know, it's one of those standard rules. And I feel the same about place. You don't get to give out about the place. You don't get to give out about the planning permissions that's granted or the zoning if you didn't have your say in the public consultation.
Sure, another factor is though that these American kids that were working in diners and all, they were sending thousands of dollars back to their parents back to home.
And I suppose that's a very valid one as well.
I think pros and cons here, guys. I think we could argue this all day, and basically you're going to come down to the positives and the negatives. So it's going to be both, because you both made very valid points there, which is lovely. It's great debating.
She's the epitome of democracy.
Yeah,
actually, Emma,
definitely.
just for anybody in the areas like Athlone and in Cork City and some of the Ballymahan and some of the areas that you mentioned, where can all of that information be found in terms of public consultation?
Well, on their own websites as well, but we'll have Place Engage. So if you check out Place Engage, all those details will be on that. So definitely check it out.
Super. PlaceEngage.com. That's great.
Yes.
Okay, Emma, that was Emma Hayes, Head of New Media with Property District. Thank you so much for joining us, Emma, and for mediating this discussion.
Glad to do it. That's
no punches thrown anyway.
Thank you, Emma.
Your community radio for South Dublin. This is Dublin South FM.
This is indeed Dublin South FM, and Property Matters of the programme. With me is I'm Bryan Fox, and here is Carol Tallon as well. On Twitter it's iPropertyRadio, or email at iPropertyRadio.com. Now we have Trevor Kelly. He's public loss assessor and property claims expert at Insurance Claims Solutions. Welcome, Trevor, back again.
Thanks very much, Brian.
Good to see you. Let's just ask you the first question. How do you select the correct insurance policy, and what sort of level of policy coverage do you need for your needs and coverage for your needs?
Yeah, just take it back one step. Basically, we deal with claims and people have suffered property damage. So we're there to sort of pick up the pieces. So what I would say to people is the most important way to get your full entitlement is to make sure that your insurance policy is in place correctly before the incident. So you're giving yourself a very, very unfair disadvantage if you don't have a correct policy. So typically your home is one of your biggest investments, or the assets that you would hold. I come across policyholders very, very regularly that wouldn't have the correct levels of policy or the correct insurance policy in place to cover all the eventualities. So whilst the property is usually the homeowner's most expensive asset or investment, many instances little consideration is given to the intricacies of the policy, the sums insured, or the value at risk. And in the event of a claim, this can lead to policyholders thousands or tens of thousands out of pocket.
Okay, but where does this problem start from? Because I know myself, having worked with property buyers, particularly first-time buyers, but and investors over a decade, there's so much happening at the time you buy your first property that actually buyers can be very overwhelmed, and they're just not familiar with it. And in fact, one of the things that's quite confusing is that people think they're covered. So for example, as part of the mortgage, they will have been required to get certain insurances and assurances, and therefore they think they're covered. They don't understand what's necessary really for the benefit of the bank or the mortgage holder, for the mortgage, the mortgage lender, and what's relevant for them. Because you mentioned there that your home or your property is your most expensive asset, but actually your mortgage is more likely to be the most expensive investment that you make. So do you think that there's some crossover between the insurances that people are required to take out, and so maybe are then just not getting the best or maybe independent advice at mortgage stage?
Right, so when you're buying a new property, one of your mortgage stipulations would be that you take out property insurance to cover the amount of the loan that's there. Your insurance policy, you must set it up for the full reinstatement value. If the building was destroyed and had to be rebuilt from scratch, knocked down and rebuilt. So at the time of taking out or renewing your insurance policy, it's typically left up to the policyholder to set and declare the sums insured. So what does that mean? That means that you'll have to tell your bank how much, or tell your mortgage provider or your insurance provider how much you want your contents and buildings insured for. So it's up to you. They will advise you to get it independently checked, but it's very, very unusual.
That's where
to do
you come
that.
in, though, right?
Yeah, we can offer that service. We don't. It's not our main service, but we can offer a value at risk survey for policyholders to make sure that they have the correct sum insured to start with. So when you have a claim in your home, your insurance company will send out a loss adjuster, a claims representative, to investigate the claim, take photos, take the measurements, the details of the loss. Also, another one of their roles is to measure the property and its environs to determine exactly what the correct value at risk is. So the value at risk is what you should be insured for. The sum insured is what you are insured for. Now, if its value at risk is found to be more than the sum insured, so basically if you're saying 25% underinsured, then in the event of a claim, your insurance company will take off 25% of the claim settlement. what's called average. So they take off, because you're deemed to be self-insured for the period that you're underinsured by, or the amount that you're underinsured by. So if you're insured for 300,000, you should be insured for 400,000. Then you have €100,000 shortfall, which is 25%. So if you have a claim to that property and it's €100,000 claim, what they'll do is they'll multiply 100,000 by your 300,000, what you are insured for, and divide it by the value of risk, the 400,000, what you should be insured for. So instead of getting 100,000 in your claim payment, you'd only get 75,000, because you are self-insured for that proportion that you're underinsured. That's called average in your home insurance policy.
Okay, now that sounds like something that could potentially trip up inexperienced homeowners. So, when you see that scenario actually in day-to-day, in your day-to-day work, is that likely to occur because buyers got their mortgage and then just renewed, or got their home insurance day one and then just renewed it but didn't reassess the value and they just keep renewing it? Or does your insurance company at renewal stage prompt you to review the value?
Yeah, at renewal stage they will send you out your renewal documents, and they'll ask you, are you happy to proceed with them documents? Are you happy? Do you need to increase the values? So although some of the small print will say that you should get it independently valued, basically people are busy enough, people are shopping around for the policy, they're trying to save 10 or 15, 20 euro here, there or everywhere, so they're not really looking at the sum insured because they don't think anything's ever going to happen to them. So what I would say is if I would see 10 claims in a day, 3 or 4 of them would be underinsured, and they'd be underinsured circa 10 to 40%. So that would
40% would be very significant.
Yeah, typically if you have a large home, people don't really emphasise the importance of having the correct insurance. They may have built it 10 or 15 years earlier. They may have done it with direct labour, and they may think that it costs a lot less to build it. Now, the Society of Chartered Surveyors Society of Chartered Surveyors issue a rebuilding calculator or rebuilding guide, which the insurance company use to apply to your value at risk. So that includes the property be rebuilt and all the professional fees in relation to it. It's a very, very simple calculator. Society of Chartered Surveyors. It's the rebuilding value. You put in the square footage of your building, you select your area, whether it be Dublin, North East, Cork, Limerick, South East, West, put the square footage in, the type of building. It'll give you a very good indication of what your correct sum insured should be. That's what your insurance company will use to determine what the value at risk is, or what you should be insured for.
Do you think then that what's your own analysis, what's your own take on our houses, properties in this country underinsured? Well,
I'd see like 30 to 40%, 30 to 40%.
That big?
Yeah. And when you go out of Dublin, it actually gets worse because you have bigger properties, you have less standardised stock. Where you're in Dublin, there's a lot of 3-bed, 4-bed standardised stock. They can only be valued for so much. But when I had down the southeast, I had a client who had a fire last year. He was insured for 200,000. The value at risk was 500,000. So essentially, he was 60% underinsured. Now, fortunately, that insurance policy that he had with a major insurer didn't have average on it, so it didn't have a deduction for underinsurance average. But what it did have was a deduction for wear and tear because of the level of underinsurance. So that was one that we had 20% deduction for off the bat, just because he wasn't correctly insured. I think that was a claim that was in around 300,000.
But if he only had to take that 20% drop, obviously that could have been much worse, because he might have had to take a 60% drop.
Yeah.
So how does a scenario like that arise?
Well, it's just people not educating themselves in relation to... It's not educating themselves. It's not putting the emphasis on the correct people. It's only affecting people when they're having a claim, and they realise when they have a claim it's really too late to correct your sum insured. You can only basically correct it for the next year or the next claim.
So basically then people are just signing off on renewals without any sort of reevaluation.
Exactly, and the lack of people going through local insurance brokers is a big factor in that, because a local insurance broker would generally know the road, the house, the stock, and if they seem to be underinsured, they would generally be able to flag that. But the problem is people are buying them off internet companies and direct from insurance providers who don't have a relationship, don't come out and check the property. So if you buy off a good local broker, they'll be able to advise you, if not what you should be insured for, but who to employ in order to correctly assess your sum insured. So I'm an advocate for the small insurance broker, the local insurance broker, because in the event of a small claim, they can even help you out as well. They can advocate on your behalf.
But even if it was a natural disaster such a fire or flooding, a lot of people could be in a lot of trouble.
Definitely,
if their house had to be completely demolished.
And I deal with people who are in a lot of trouble, and I'm trying to get them out of that, trying to get them out of the mess, but
does a lot of this come down to the fine print? Like insurers, when you phone up for a quote, you're given a headline quote, but actually the coverage might be very different. So in fact, what happens when you're comparing quotes generally is that you're not comparing like with like anyway.
Yeah, I would find between the 5 and 6 major providers in the country, the major insurers, you will have big differences in levels of cover, levels of excesses, endorsements, policy wording, claims conditions, sums insured. So it's always good to speak to somebody who's dealing with claims in the coalface about before you select your insurance policy. Determine exactly, when it comes to a claim, are they reputable? Will they pay up? Will they play silly buggers? Whatever it is. So really, not every insurance policy is the same, and you do pay for what you get. And if you're buying an insurance policy for £200, there seems to be something amiss. I don't know how the insurance company would make money out of that. So what I would say is check the exclusions, check the fine print, which nobody will anyway. So it's always very important to get independent advice off a local broker, or anyone can contact me. I'm accessible on the phone, and I'll tell them very, very quickly.
What is your website, Trevor?
Yeah, my website's insuranceclaimsolutions.ie, and I'm available for sort of any complimentary advice in relation to work in relation to queries like that.
Yeah, Trevor, I think the last time you were in, I said that you had probably terrified our audience, so we said we'd have you back in to explain things in better detail, and I think you've actually you've done a better job in terrifying them. When you talk there about the importance of wording, that sounds almost like there's the potential for home buyers to be tripped up. And if you're saying that 3 or 4 out of every 10 that you see can be between 10 and 40% underinsured, that's a huge problem. So, I mean, is there a point where, I understand that people going in day one, they're trying to cut costs everywhere. They're doing, what their mortgage broker and their bank are advising them, or their solicitor in some case are advising them to do. But at what point do you really need to not automatically renew your insurance? Like, is it kind of at the end of year 3, do you say, okay, now we need to actually look and reevaluate, or is it maybe year 5, or is this the kind of thing that actually if you do it every decade you're fine?
Well, I would say last year is probably the best time to do it, and then the next best time is next year. So your insurance is a continual process. So we have inflation, we have construction cost index, and that the rebuilding costs will track that very closely. So if you see it's a 5% increase in construction costs over 12 months, you're probably okay adding 5% onto your SCS. It couldn't be any simpler. Society of Chartered Surveyors update that list every year. It takes, I'd say, 2.5 minutes to go in and put if you know your building, your square footage, length by breadth, multiply by the amount of stories, put in your house type, it'll give you the calculator within 5%.
Do you think part of people not doing this is because they're afraid if they increase the value then it's increasing the premium?
No, I don't think it is, because a slight increase in your value will not make a big difference in the premium, because your premium is based on the risk, and you have a certain risk that you have insured. So if you add another 20,000 onto that, you may see an increase of 10 to 15 euro. It's not going to...
What would you see as risk? I mean, risk in terms of?
Your risk, your value at risk. So your risk would be your property. So your full... when I say your risk, I would mean that you're loading. So if you take your policy with your provider, that's a certain risk. But to add 20 or 10% onto that risk is not a great deal, because they've priced for the actual risk to start with. You're only just applying the value. So essentially it's like the same as a car. So once you pay for the initial risk, then any additions on top of that, they're not going to be great, because they've already got themselves covered with that. Right. So
in terms of premium, then, I mean, would the house buyer getting a better premium deal if they're buying a new house as opposed to an old house? Is that, would they be determined?
When you're taking out a policy, they have certain assumptions that are made, that the house is of good construction, that it's not 100 years old, that it's has no non-standard construction items, or up to 30%, has five lever mortise locks, has alarms, all that sort of stuff. So once you meet that criteria, but to be said for period properties and specialist properties, they would have a special risk, and you mightn't be able to buy that off the general market. You may have to go to a specialist market like Lloyd's in order to cover that, because obviously they're a higher risk.
So therefore you'd need to get some advice from your mortgage broker if you're going to go that way.
Well, your insurance broker, your mortgage broker generally would sell you insurance, but may not have the expertise to advise you correctly on it.
I genuinely think that that's what's happening, and I'm not sure that people in the throes of trying to secure their mortgage, when they're actually trying to secure their new home, potentially even their first home, I'm just not sure that this is even on their radar, and they think that what they're being sold, they're covered.
Yes.
So you could say a lot of people don't take 100% mortgages, and your bank will only want you to cover their proportion of the amount that they're liable for. So they're not really concerned about the 20 or 30% that you put in yourself or you've upgraded. So essentially, if you have a 20% deposit and you're only insuring for 80% of the value, but remember, it's 80% of the reinstatement value, not the market value of the property. And depending on where the economy is, the actual reinstatement value might be more than the market value. 2008, 2009, the property values were much below the cost of construction, but you would have had to insure it for the construction, the reconstruction and the reinstatement. So you might have actually, the property might have been the reinstatement value might have been worth double the actual cost of the property, or the value of the property, but it's the reinstatement, not the market value, that you insure for.
Interesting.
It's worrying, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay. Trevor, thank you so much for joining us again. That was Trevor Kelly, public loss assessor and property claims expert at Insurance Claims Solutions. Trevor, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up after the break, we'll be joined by Des McCabe of the Apartment Owners Network.
Everything's fine on 93.9 Dublin South FM.
And you're very welcome back to Property Matters with me, Bryan Fox and Carol Tallon. On Twitter, it's iPropertyRadio, or on email, it's hello@iPropertyRadio.com. Now, in studio is Des McCabe. Des is a voluntary director of the Apartments Owners Network. And I have in front of me your report, Des. So I take it you are obviously looking after owners' apartments.
Yes, the Apartment Owners Network, just to give you a bit of background, it's a voluntary group set up probably over 10 years ago now. And it's a self-help group. Owners and directors of OMCs come together, meet on a regular basis, discuss the issues, and I suppose to try and promote best practice in the industry, and lobby for new legislation.
Very interesting, because
I was going to ask, were you involved in lobbying for these reforms, the reforms of the report that was issued between Clúid Housing and the housing agency there for sustainable apartment living for Ireland?
Yeah, so that'll be our focus now going forward, is to try and get the recommendations in that report implemented with the government. I know a regulator is one of the main...
This is what Darragh O'Brien is looking for, is it, in terms of his legislation? Am I right? Am I on the right track there?
Yeah, well, yes, it would be. I mean, I suppose the Apartment Owners Network would like to see a regulator that would oversee the OMC sector.
Right. He's looking for an ombudsman, isn't he?
Yeah, which would be something... It should be something similar.
I think certainly at the launch of the report with Clúid Housing and the housing agency, there were a number of portfolio managers there and approved housing bodies, of course, and I think they definitely came down on the side of wanting a regulator more so than an ombudsman. Okay. But perhaps if there could be some coherence or tie-in between, say, the Residential Tenancies Board and some of really to tie in that you don't have a number of different regulators across different property sectors, but maybe have one that's dealing with owner management companies and other issues affecting tenancies and rentals. So it's a huge issue for people, but you're dealing with a network. So talk to us about because I know last week, Bryan, yourself and Emma talked about some of the proposed changes, and certainly we'll get into these, but can you maybe tell us a little bit about the experiences that your members are having that made this network necessary?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it goes back, I suppose, to the boom years in the noughties, when apartment building, mushroomed, and there's a lot of legacy issues from that. But I suppose one of the main issues that directors of OMCs are voluntary, and they don't necessarily have a background or training, and then they're and most of it out of goodwill and public service look to try and become directors of their OMC to make obviously their own living environment good and for the people around them as well. But they don't have any training, and I suppose they're managing multi-million property portfolios effectively now. So that's one of the big challenges.
Are you dealing with mainly investors or owner occupiers?
Both. Mainly owner occupiers. I suppose the network would be more balanced or lean towards owner occupiers, but there would be investors as well. We don't distinguish between, once you're an apartment owner, we welcome you.
Because I did see one of the recommendations is actually for mandatory training.
Yes.
To serve as a director of an owner's management company.
Yeah.
Are you in favour of that?
I would be. I think it's something we need to be a little bit careful of, because if you have too much training or it's too onerous, people will obviously, it's hard enough to get directors to come on board. So there's a balance there of people having the knowledge to be able to director, but not scaring them away at the same time. So yes, but I would be in favour of mandatory training. But as I said, I always think there's two types of directors out there. One where they have a competent managing agent involved, and then they're running the estate on a day-to-day basis, and they are looking at project work and the high-level budgets. And then there are people who have to deal with a huge amount of legacy issues, either being with the developer or building defects, bad debt, and they need a lot more support. But I do favour, some sort of mandatory training.
Am I under the wrong impression in that it's difficult to get people that are living in those apartments to come together on boards of management?
Yes, very difficult, yeah. I mean, I think that would be everyone's experience. I mean, my own experience is, I'd say only about 10% of our members come to our AGM every 10%?
year. 10%?
Yeah. And is that through fear or through indifference?
Indifference. And I think if they feel it's relatively well, I mean, it can be a positive sign too, because they feel there isn't anything major that would force them to come. But I still think at the same time it's bad, because there is an indifference and people think sort of the status quo can just continue on forever,
But is there a difficulty there in terms of communications as well? Because we would generally take a strong focus towards the technology that's making things like this easier. And a couple of weeks ago we had Andrew Farrell from Block Angel in, and have you heard of these block communication tools, where essentially you have an app for a building that connects all of the owners, so that not only are they notified of meetings, but they, more importantly, if they can't attend the meeting, they actually have a mechanism to speak to each other and exchange information and maybe vote on topics. So I just wonder, are we, when we expect people to turn up to these events, given how we live now and how we work now, are we automatically excluding certain people? Maybe because of language barriers, cultural barriers, working hours. Are we excluding people by not allowing them to contribute and have their say, maybe through an app on their smartphone, when the technology exists?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very good point. I think going forward, I think OMCs are probably slow to pick up the technology baton and use it to help them. So I think, that's an excellent point, that maybe to look, because generally, I suppose the managing agent would have the day-to-day running of the OMC. I suppose that's something maybe the managing agents and they
should be looking at,
and their associations should be looking at.
Well, if you're running a public meeting and only 10% turn up, surely that's kind of an indicator that more people are affected. So therefore, more people are likely to get involved if we make it easier for them to get involved. And the reality is, in terms of communications and how we live now, not everybody's going to turn up to an event like that, and sometimes there's there's a feeling that, you know, a little bit like you said, complacency. Well, look, if I don't do it, somebody will do it. Whereas actually, if you give people a voice, make them more informed, they're more likely to feel connected and part of it, so that they will feel a responsibility as you know, to contribute.
Yeah, no, I think it's an excellent point, and I think it's something both the OMC, through the Apartment Owners Network, and the managing agents should really try and embrace a bit more and look to bring on. Yeah, no, it's an excellent idea, I think. Yeah.
What have been the biggest challenges you've faced? I mean, you know, one of the things that comes out in the report is obviously about dispute resolution and sanctions for non-compliance. So I presume, right down to the basic, not paying your management charges.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably for most developments that's probably number one on their list of issues that they have to deal with. For some, it's very big, particularly for apartments sold during the boom years where people bought at the top of the market and they're in negative equity, so and they're finding both to pay their mortgage and to pay management fees. It's a struggle. And then I think for developments that are a bit older, there's probably more legacy debt, but they're probably in a better position. But yeah, I think, I mean, there's a culture in Ireland of not paying management fees.
I thought so. Yeah.
Where does that come from? You know, genuinely, I'm interested because, you know, I grew up on a dairy farm. I now live outside the city. So, you know, I can remember living in apartments in Spain, and you know, these things were just paid. It wasn't questioned. And but on the other side of it, you saw the value because, you know, there was never any rubbish around. Bins were always collected, so you knew what value you were getting.
And
do we have a value problem?
As well, I dare say.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be a cultural thing in Ireland. I mean, I think people still see apartments as maybe an investment or just a stepping stone on the property ladder. They like if they don't take it.
So it's not a proper dwelling as such.
If they don't take it seriously enough or something like that. I mean, we still have one of the lowest apartment living in the EU. I think it's 7.3%. It's very low. But
that's set to increase. In fact, it's set to double in a very short space of time. And I know Ronan Lyons has frequently said that we need 2 million apartments by 2050.
Yeah, and one other statistic is 90,000 extra apartments in Dublin will be needed in the short term to meet demand. So yeah, I mean, it's part. We can't continue with our 3-bed semi and our garden. It's not sustainable.
We don't have that.
Do a lot of these problems come back to, you know, maybe those developments built during the boom time where the developers retained apartments and so therefore were part of the management company but not active in the management company, and when they go bust, what happens to the communal areas?
Yes, I mean, when I joined the network first, I would have said that was probably, after the bad debts, probably the second biggest issue was what we call vesting the common areas over to the OMC. Now the MUD Act has dealt with that, so you must actually transfer your common areas over to your OMC before the first unit is sold. But
for anything built prior to 2011,
then it's still an issue. I mean, even in our development, even though the developer never sought to have influence or control it, he never actually vested the common areas over until we went chasing for it.
But did the development company still exist as a company?
It did, yeah.
So you were probably in a more fortunate position than many.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people where the actual developer goes bust and that underlying company goes bust and still has title to the common areas, I think there's a big legal issue there.
It reverts to the state. As far as I know, it reverts to the state, and there's a court order required to show that it has reverted to the state. And then actually, does it need to be gifted back by the minister?
I think that's the procedure people have to take, yeah. But I mean, back in the boom years, a lot of developers were looking to retain control of the OMC because there was land attached on the common areas, and they were looking to try and develop that long term. I mean, they even had a lien on it. They would hold one car parking space as a lien on it on the OMC. Gradually, they're being resolved, but I think there is some legacy of that still outstanding. Yeah. What
sort of satisfaction rate would there be in terms of the owner and the the estate agent, the estate management company, would there be a slight distrust of them or a slight?
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably goes back to the factor of people not paying their service charge. Disgruntled with the managing agent and maybe the service they get out of them. But I see, and people still don't distinguish between the managing agent and the management company. And often your issues lie with the management company as opposed with the managing agent. I mean, at the end of the day, the owners have ownership of the management company.
They're part of it.
They're part of it. And so they're part of the solution as well. So they must come together through the management company to ensure that they have a successful development. And then from that, they appoint a competent managing agent and have a good relationship with the managing agent. But I think there is legacy, yes, there where there's a bit of distrust between owners and the managing agent in some developments.
Yeah. And speaking of legacy, is there more of a standardisation being sought in terms of sinking funds? Because we're at that stage now where you have legacy buildings that maybe fees weren't being paid on, so therefore maybe low or virtually no sinking funds, and you've got people buying in today that suddenly might have a very large share or responsibility towards maintenance of a building that hasn't been maintained over the past 15 years.
Yeah, well, again, I think probably one of the biggest issues now going forward for OMCs is building up a correct sinking fund. A lot of people are putting notional amounts in a sinking fund. I know the MUD Act mentioned 200 euros per unit, but no one could ever find out how they came up with that figure. So that could be for some developments, because the OMC sector deals with, say, maybe houses in a managed estate or duplexes where the costs are a lot less. That could be an appropriate figure. But for apartments, probably 200 is way below what's needed.
And actually, that's a really important point. When we talk about owners, management companies, we're not just talking about apartment blocks. It's actually multi-unit developments.
I was just going to come to that point. They're no longer maintained now by local authorities. It's the actual residents that have to maintain them.
Often, even when you drive into an estate, an open estate, there could be an underlying OMC that looks after the common areas and cuts the grass.
But that is the trend now, isn't it, nowadays?
That's the trend, yeah.
Where do we need to get to? We know under Project 2040 that 500,000 new homes are required, and more than half of those are needed in Dublin. And in fact, most of the estimates say that actually that's probably half what we really need. So if we're talking about 500,000 new homes in Dublin, the chances are the majority of those are going to be apartments. We're all going to have to learn how to live in closer proximity to each other. There's a cultural shift needed, surely, if only 7.3% of the population are living in apartments now. How do we change that culture?
Well, again, I suppose to the work to the apartment owners network and everyone else involved in the sector, I think trying to make selling an apartment and trying to make it an attractive proposition to live, not just short term for a year or two, but long term where you could spend most of your life in an apartment. I think it's a very important message we get across, and that's for all stakeholders. Government, I think we really need to promote apartment living and everyone living in closer quarters together, because there are benefits there's a worldwide trend now to live in urban areas. So there are disadvantages, but you have the advantages of public transport, cultural events close by, no need for a car. So I think all those aspects just need to be emphasised more.
Is it fair to say we need to get the design right so it actually suits people at different stages of life?
That's true. I mean, I think traditionally in Ireland apartments were geared towards single couples, not families.
Starters,
and that needs to change.
Look, I think it comes back to the changes and how we live now, and this is something that I think we're going to be talking about for a long while to come. So Des, thank you so much for joining us. That was Des McCabe, Voluntary Director of the Apartment Owners Network. Thank you to all of our guests who've been in studio with us today, from Bryan Fox and myself, Carol Tallon. Thank you for joining us. Shane Flynn was on sound and producer was Kate Tallon. Next up on Dublin South FM is Bowl of Soul.
Brilliant.